Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Mr. Lincoln's Drummer, Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is kind of a long chapter, and there are then 2 pages of epilogue. So I'm dividing it, and I'm just reading part 1. Part 2 will finish the chapter and read the epilogue. So Willie is sick. He's not wounded, but he's sick and running fevers, and they have him at a hospital. I was still in Virginia that Christmas of 1862 while the 3rd Vermont bled on the snow-covered battleground at Fredericksburg. I tried to regain my strength. The chills and fever had lost their grip weeks earlier, but I had withered down to 70 pounds, and the doctors insisted I put some weight onto my bony limbs before departing the ward. I never could stand to be left out of things, and those months in the hospital seemed to stretch into decades. I had been away from home last Christmas, but Pa had been with me. Now I had no one. The few fellows I met in the hospital never stayed long enough to become friends. Jace Wheeler visited on his way back to the regiment. He had deserted up north, but the provost caught up with him and sent him on to the 3rd. I celebrated Christmas with a few soldiers left at the hospital. Most of them were victims of a measles outbreak at Fort Monroe, and the youngest was 19. I sang a few songs, but they wouldn't share a cake. One of the freed slaves had baked for them, so I returned to my bed and passed the rest of the night alone. The next morning, a letter arrived from Ma, which cheered me considerably. The doctors then ordered me down the hall, stripped me bare, and started up there poking and pinching again. "He's still thin," one of them complained. "What do you expect?" I asked. "The food's terrible here." "Send him home," a bespectacled young surgeon declared. "He's right about the food. He needs home cooking more than he needs to stay around here." In the end, they did not send me home. Instead, the first week of January, I marched onto a schooner bound for Baltimore. I sailed north with 7 other young soldiers in a single cabin, but I didn't mind. The walls kept most of the chill and all the wind out, and the ship's cook brought us hot soup by the bucket. We ate until our bowls were empty, and then we filled them up again. The ship docked 2 days later at Baltimore, and I was met by a tall, red-headed corporal. "Johnston, Willie?" he called. "That's me," I said, handing over a packet of papers. "I'm Ben Sparks," he said, shaking my hand. "Don't let the stripes fool you either. I'm just 17 myself, and I'll thrash you if you try saluting or calling me Corporal Sparks. I've never been more than Ben to anyone." "Suits me, Ben," I said, grinning. "They tell you anything?" I asked. "No," I replied, "only that I'm going to Baltimore." "You are assigned to the General Hospital West Building," he explained as he led me to a waiting ambulance. "Oh, not another hospital," I muttered. "Oh, you're not a patient this time. The United States Army, in its wisdom, has decided all those months in the sick ward qualify you as a nurse." "What?" "That's right," Ben insisted. "You are now assigned to the hospital as a nurse." My scowl must have said everything, because Ben let me sit silently beside him on the ambulance seat as he nudged the solitary mule into a slow trot. "It's not so bad," he assured me. He didn't seem to expect a reply, and I offered none. My year in the Army had taught me that soldiers aren't really expected to enjoy themselves, nor are they expected to think or complain. I'll admit that some don't think, but we nearly all complain. Ben proved to be right about nursing duty, though. West Building was just part of a large complex of hospital buildings, and the ward where I worked was full of soldiers recovering from wounds. There were young ones and old ones, and there were from every state left in the Union. I even saw a few from the Vermont Brigade, though none were from the 3rd. Best of all, I was paid 8 months' wages minus the cost of a uniform. It still came to almost $90. I kept 5 and mailed the rest home to Ma. The doctors did most of the serious work at West. After a time, Ben taught me how to change dressing, and I helped some of the men with their food. We had a little drummer, Terrence Flynn, who was even shorter and skinnier than me. A rebel cannonball had taken Terry's right arm off. I took over feeding him. "I guess somebody will be doing this for the rest of my life," he said sourly when I brought his dinner one day. "Well, no longer than you allow it," I told him. "You've still got a left hand. You may not be much good beating a drum, but you can feed yourself." "Well, how would you know?" he grumbled. "Look here," I said, taking the spoon in my left hand and dipping it in the chicken broth. "Little children can feed themselves and they fall over their own feet. I've seen men in here with both legs shot off who don't feel half as sorry for themselves as you do. If that ball had lopped off your head, sure, you could holler some, but an arm? That's nothing." "Well, you've got both of yours," he noted. "Want me to cut mine off to make you feel better?" He grinned for the first time when I took his knife and pointed it at my arm. "Well, that would be mighty stupid," he observed. "I can't grow you another arm, Terry," I told him. "Nobody can. But I'll help you learn to use the left one. And until then, I'll loan you mine." "It wouldn't fit," he said, "but I appreciate the offer. Anyway, you don't look well enough to spare it." I did my best to puff myself up, but it was a failure. I told Terry about the months in the hospital, and he shared a frightful tale of how the 42nd New York, his regiment, lost close to 200 men at Antietam Creek back in September. Every man in the hospital had his stories, and I listened to each one. Sometimes I wrote letters home for the ones with broken or amputated hands or arms. I did it for the blind men, too. We had quite a few of them in West Building. My penmanship was none too good, and my spelling was worse. Nobody seemed to mind, though. I offered to pen a letter for Terry, but he shook his head. "I've only got an old aunt back home, and she wouldn't care," he explained. "I joined because my shoe shine customers all left to sign up. My pa always said I should follow the trade, you see." By far the best days at West were the rare occasions when visitors appeared. Sometimes a soldier's ma or sister would make the trip. I never could decide which one was more welcome. We all saw our own mothers in those worried faces, and some of the men nearly came to blows over who got to talk to the sisters. In February, we had a whole handful of girls from a female college. I volunteered to show them around, but for once Ben became Corporal Sparks. He escorted a pretty freckle-faced 18-year-old from Annapolis from bed to bed while I did all the work. Aside from feeding the wounded and writing letters, I took care of irksome duties like changing linen and cleaning up. Ben insisted on tending the bloodier wounds, and he always carted off the bodies when somebody died. "Oh, I'm used to it," he said, turning me away. "Besides, you get so close to them." He did too, but I didn't argue. On February 12th, Terry Flynn's stump festered, and the doctors carried him off to do some more cutting. They didn't bring him back. I think they knew it was hopeless, Ben told me afterwards, but with somebody so young, they needed to try. "I suppose it didn't matter that he learned to use his left hand," I grumbled. "I've seen a lot of men and more than a few boys pass through here," Ben said, sighing. "Lots die. I don't see many of them smile, and even fewer laugh. You made that little fella happy a time or two, and that merits some pride on your part, Willie. Don't stop trying to help because you lose a man or two. Or a boy." "Exactly," Ben added. "I ever tell you why I stay here?" I never thought to ask Ben. "Most judge I don't care to rejoin my regiment." "I wouldn't blame you," I explained. "Besides, you limp some." "Yeah," Ben said, rolling up his trouser leg. "I always thought there was flesh and bone down there, but I was wrong. Ben Sparks had a wooden leg." "I never knew," I said, growing pale. "Well, don't tell anyone, Willie. I don't want their tears or their sympathy. My regiment can't take me back, you see, and I won't go home and sip tea with the old ladies on my grandma's porch. I do some good here. You do too." It hurts, though, I said, rubbing the moisture from my eyes, when somebody like Terry up and dies. Well, you start worrying when it doesn't, Ben advised. When you get so hard and cold that you can look past the suffering, then you might as well be dead yourself. Everybody here deserves a tear or two from us, if from nobody else. I guess so, I agreed. You know so. I never did get accustomed to patients dying, and I tried to take everyone's minds off the sadness by sharing humorous episodes from the war. I read accounts of misadventures that were published in the newspapers, and I passed on others told to me by soldiers. Most of the men, especially the badly wounded ones, pleaded for news of the war. Ben or I would report on the campaigns after each meal. Things were looking better for the Union that spring, and we confidently predicted Richmond's fall. One of the favorite stories enjoyed by all that march concerned a band of men sent south to spy on the rebels. They were led by a man named Andrews, and they wound up stealing a rebel train and tearing across the countryside. In the end, most were captured. Several were hanged, including Andrews himself. 6 of the survivors became the first to receive a new medal granted by Congress. I wouldn't mind having one of those, a lanky New Yorker named Hendricks told me. Only problem is that I never once did anything brave. I got myself shot running as fast as I could through a cornfield. If I had known the rebels were on both sides of us, I would have stayed put. Personally, I didn't give much thought to medals. I had no girlfriend waiting for me back home, and Ma would probably make me stand up in church and show it off to the fat-faced old neighbor women. They liked to pinch my cheeks, and I couldn't abide that. After I was in Baltimore 8 months, Ben brought word that I was wanted at the hospital headquarters. I supposed that I was finally being sent back to the 3rd, but when I arrived, a tallish major decked out in yards of gold braid and wearing a gleaming sword took me aside. "You're Willie Johnston, 3rd Vermont?" he asked. "My father's also in the 3rd, I explained. "You might want him." "He was also in Company D? A musician?" "Oh, no, sir," I replied. "I suppose you had the right Johnston after all." He led me down the hall to an orderly room. We stepped inside together, and he drew a small notebook out of his pocket. "Tell me about it," he suggested. "About what?" I asked. "Why, the 7 days, of course." By then, the battles of Savage's Station and White Oak Swamp Bridge and Malvern Hill had been grouped together and called the 7 days. I didn't care much for that notion. I told the major that. "Well, just describe what you saw, Willie," he instructed, "what you remember." I did so. It didn't take long. So much had happened since then. I did recall the heat and the dust, and I remember the sea of dead men at Malvern Hill. Most of all, I remembered the day Mr. Lincoln came to Harrison's Landing. "The president does make an impression, doesn't he?" the major asked. "Yes, sir," I agreed. The major left shortly thereafter, but he returned 2 days later. "We have a short journey to make," he explained. "I have my duties here," I pointed out. "Oh, a replacement has been assigned. You have more important matters awaiting you." "What matters?" I didn't like the sound of it one bit. "I'll explain it all along the way. First, though, we need to get you ready." Most days I wore an apron over my shirt and ignored my tunic altogether. Tending the wounded, you were apt to get blood on your clothes. We sent the aprons to the laundry every night and took a fresh one. That way, we kept a good deal cleaner. And I'm going to stop right here. I'll finish this up the next time. Bye-bye.